Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Carolyn Waters, the Director and Head Librarian here at the New York Society Library, and we're delighted to have you all here. Before we get started, we acknowledge that the library stands on the traditional lands of the Lenape people and other indigenous peoples to whom we pay respect. And another note, if you could please silence your cell phones or anything that might make noise so you don't inadvertently become a part of the program. If you are new to the library, I just want to let you know that we are the oldest library and cultural institution in New York City, founded in 1754. And we are a membership library, which means that we would love to have you join us. We're open to all. Normally we have a public reference room, but due to our renovation, it is currently closed, unfortunately. But membership is open to all, and we would love to have you join us. We put on many programs like tonight, but I'm going to turn this off because it's a little bit doing something odd. And I think I can project. We have many programs just like tonight's, wonderful programs, lectures, performances, and also writing workshops and reading seminars and children's programs. We have children's library. We have over 300,000 books in open stacks, glorious open stacks that you can go in and browse to your heart's delight and check out. And gorgeous reading and writing spaces like the room that you're in right now. So we would love to have you join us. And we also sell day passes if you're not ready to fully commit. We're pleased to have tonight longtime library member Ellen Feldman in conversation with Liza Bennett on Liza's book, Georgia and Anita, which was published just last week. So we're really excited to be one of the first places. Ellen Feldman is a 2009 Guggenheim Fellow, is the author of The Trouble with You, The Living and the Lost, Paris Never Leaves You, The Boy Who Loved Anne Frank, and Scottsboro, which was shortlisted for the Orange Prize. That is just a small list of all of her novels, which are in the stacks, the open stacks. Liza Bennett is a full-time writer and former advertising executive. She has published 10 novels, including Local Knowledge, So Near, A Place for Us, and Bleeding Heart under her maiden name, Liza Gyllenhaal. Georgia and Anita is her first work of nonfiction. She is the past board chair and longtime board member of the Academy of American Poets, currently serving on the Emeritus Board, and is the secretary of the West Stockbridge Historical Society.
You wonder if they're here. And anyone here?
It's good to know we have some Stockbridge fans. She divides her time between New York City and the Berkshire Hills in Massachusetts, and she also offers musings on writing, gardening, reading, poetry, and life in the Berkshires on her blog, lizagyllenhaal.com. New York Magazine editor Frederick E. Allen calls her new book a masterpiece, an exquisitely told story of love, art, feminism, family, and the making of the modern age, propelled by deep and turbulent current of a decades-long friendship between two extraordinary women. We have copies of both authors' books for sale from our friends from the corner bookstore just outside the door, and I'm sure that the authors would be happy to sign them after the event. I am now very pleased to hand off to Ellen and Liza.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, from both of us. Thank you. I am absolutely delighted to be here talking about this book tonight because there is so much in it. I've read it more than once, I have to admit, at different stages. There is so much in it I love and admire. The psychological acuity with which Liza treats the characters, something that's so hard to do in fiction. She writes about making visual art, and that is extremely hard to write about, and she makes it very real. It's about women's friendship, and it's about who's the real feminist in the room, and so much more. So to get started and let Liza tell you about it, I know you had a lot of drafts of this book, Liza, some of which I read, and can you talk about the evolution of it from fiction to narrative nonfiction?
Yes. Well, I had been writing contemporary fiction. Can you hear me okay? And Ellen and I are, well, we have to tell you, we're friends. And we've spent a lot of time over the years talking about writing. And I would hear her talk about the historical fiction she was working on, the way she would do research and construct a narrative. And I began to feel like what she was doing was so much more interesting and somehow important, telling the story of the inner lives of women, of real women, but doing it through the lens of historical fiction, bringing them alive that way. And I thought, this sounds better than making up these imaginary characters that I was doing. So I went to an editor who I was working with at the time with the idea that I would write an historical novel about Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz. I always had loved Georgia's work, and Stieglitz is a fascinating man. He's a photographer, probably the most famous photographer of the 20th century. He became O'Keeffe's lover and husband, and he managed her career. My editor said, that's an interesting idea. Why don't you find somebody who knows them both O'Keeffe and Stieglitz, and can tell this story from their point of view, which I thought was an interesting idea. So I began to do research, and I very quickly came upon this book of published letters between O'Keeffe and a woman named Anita Pollitzer, who was a leader of the suffragist movement. And it was letters that went across 50 years of their friendship. And the great thing about Pollitzer is she was also a very good friend of Alfred Stieglitz's. And they came from the same cultured Jewish circles. In her case, Charleston, South Carolina. In his case, New York. And when she came up from Charleston to go to school at the Art Students League, he took her under his wing and befriended her. And this just seemed like just the right person to write, to have her view them. So I began to do a lot more research, and I began to work on it, and I was writing draft after draft, some which Ellen read. It was actually ended up being at least twice as long as it is now. I thought it was pretty good. And I put it aside during the pandemic, so you can see how long I was working on it. And I looked at it again after COVID, and I realized how bad it was. I mean, it was just this overblown, overwritten thing that I didn't believe any of the characters. And, the thing you never told me is how hard it is to write good historical fiction and how easy it is to write bad historical fiction. So I just decided I had to throw out what I had done. But at the same time, I realized I really liked the story. I liked what I had learned, and as I began to strip away all the extraneous information, all that great research I put so much time into, I came down to realize that what I really wanted to write was not the story of O'Keeffe and Stieglitz, but the story of these two women and this amazing friendship. And in doing so, getting rid of all the fictional aspects that I had been working on, I really realized it was what they call creative nonfiction. Everything in the book is factually accurate, but it's told with literary devices. So that's the long way of answering that question.
Well, you lived through it and I lived through part of it with you. Talk about getting to know the characters, because you've got three amazing people there.
Yes, excuse me, I have a little bit of allergies. Again, for me, the letters between Georgia and Anita were really key to understanding who they were. Now, early on, Georgia writes to Anita, this is early on in their correspondence, "Self-control is a wonderful thing. I think we must even keep ourselves from feeling too much if we are going to keep sane and see with a clear vision." To which Anita immediately replied, "I'd much rather live hard than long." So you get the feeling, and I began to see more and more as I got to know these women better, that Georgia really did not trust her emotions. and Anita believed in them deeply. And this dynamic was sort of fundamental to their friendship. And Ed, please, we have a place for you here. The dynamic was fundamental to their friendship, but also it was, in the end, its fatal flaw. In terms of Georgia, there's so much written about her. There's so many amazing biographies. I mean, I just stumbled upon that piece about her furniture last week. I mean, there's not an aspect of her life that, that does not have a good book about it. For me, the most important one, though, was the dual biography by Benita Eisler that was written about O'Keeffe and Stieglitz. And Eisler also wrote the introduction to those published letters between the two women. And that was a really important introduction for me, which I will get into a little bit later. But despite all this great information, she was very difficult to know. She was very hard to try to figure out her inner life. She grew up in Wisconsin. Her family owned a thriving dairy farm until two of her uncles who worked on the farm contracted tuberculosis and died. And rumor began to spread that the O'Keeffe milk was tainted. The father sold the farm, the family moved to Williamsburg. He proceeded to go through one failed business after another, and he finally left the family. Her siblings scattered. Her mother starts a boarding house in Charlottesville, Virginia, catering to University of Virginia students. And Georgia has to take, in order to survive, she has to take commercial art positions in Chicago for a while. Then she starts to do itinerant teaching. And I think she was really defensive about her past. I think it was part of her defensive personality, which added to the difficulty of getting to know her. Towards the end of the book, when I was working on the book, I decided that I wanted to have each chapter be titled and framed by a painting of hers that was appropriate to the period I was writing about. And I went back and I looked at the books I had, and I found something I had bought when I was beginning the project. It was an oversized coffee table book that included a number of her paintings, but most importantly, it included commentary that she had written about what she was thinking of when she was, working on the painting, what technique she used, the slant of the sun, through the trees. And suddenly, I found her. And I began to really understand her inner life. And I think it's because I finally concentrated on what was important to her. And that was her artwork. Now with Anita, there was much less to go on, but she was so easy to know. She was just out of the box. I sensed who this woman was. The information I was able to find was mostly online. There was the Low Country Digital Archive. The Southerners are terrific about recording every jot and tittle of their history. So if you can find this stuff, it really gives you, a rich archive. I learned a lot about her family through that, and also the letters of Anita's and the Pollitzer family, which are housed at the University of South Carolina. She grew up in a wealthy family in a thriving Jewish community in Charleston. South Carolina was religiously tolerant, very welcoming to Jews and to Jewish businesses. Her father was very successful. He was a rice merchant. The parents were the leaders of the first Reform Judaism congregation, not just in South Carolina, but in the country. And it had been founded by Anita's grandfather. So this was a very culturally sophisticated and extremely socially active family. Her older sisters were the founding members of Charleston's National Women's Party, which was founded to fight for the right to vote. And they early on co-opted Anita into this. She was the youngest of the family. She was this pretty happy, affectionate person, and that sort of emanates in everything she did in her life. So the two of them, these two women, met in 1915. They were both taking classes at the Art Students League. Georgia had to scrimp and save to get there. She was there to work. She was there to learn. And Anita, too, was there to learn, but she was also there to have fun. And she immediately sensed how talented Georgia was. And she tried everything to get to know her. And Georgia just would have, really had nothing to do with her at that point. But that summer, when Georgia had to go back to Charlottesville, she had run out of money. She knew she wasn't going to be able to go back to New York in the fall because she didn't have the funds. She was living with her mother in the boarding house. The boarding house was failing because her mother had contracted tuberculosis and was dying. She was teaching art at the University of Virginia. She was at the lowest ebb, I think, of her life. And from Anita arrives this cheery little letter talking about her happy life in Charleston and this and that. And it ended by saying, don't teach too hard and paint. And paint had been underscored. You can see the actual, I saw the actual letter and it was underscored. And I think this touched something in Georgia, who had nobody encouraging her at that point to go on with her artistic career. And this pretty chilly, defended, inward woman writes back, oh, by the way, at this point, Georgia's 28, Anita's 21. So you have a woman who's, beginning to face her 30s. She writes back, I can't begin to tell you how much I enjoyed your letter. Write me another, won't you? And the letters begin between them. This wonderful series of letters over the course of that summer and then onward through their lives. And they're not light. Some of it's light, but a lot of it is really interesting, serious discussion about art, what they're reading, what they're thinking, what they're trying to do with their art, and their real beautiful insight into how young creative people, even at that age, were coming together as friends. Georgia has to take a teaching job in the fall in this little college in South Carolina, this backwater of a place. She thought she would have time to paint. She doesn't have time to paint. She's miserable. Anita's back in New York, going to school. They're writing back and forth to each other. During the Christmas holidays, Georgia decides she has to finally face what's going to happen to her as an artist. She has to face within her how she's going to go on. And she decides that she has to forget everything she learned. She has to just get rid of all of her influences, all the techniques that she's developed, all the teachers she loved, and start all over again. And she literally gets down on her hands and knees with a piece of charcoal. She even's going to give up color. And she begins to create the series of drawings. She draws them in almost a fugue state, a panic state. She's outside of herself. And at one point, she writes to Anita, did you ever have something to say and feel as if the whole side of the wall wouldn't be big enough to say it on? And when she's done with the drawings, she rolls them up and she puts them into an old mailing tube. She sends them off to Anita in New York with a note saying, show these to no one. Because she's always been very protective of her work. And Anita opens them up and realizes immediately what a breakthrough they are. She's never seen anything like them. And typical of her, she decides that she has to show them. There's a couple of places here. She has to show them to the one person she knows who would really understand what they were, and that is Alfred Stieglitz. When all this happens, he had just turned 52. So that's the difference in age between O'Keeffe and Stieglitz. She was 28, he was 52. He, well, you probably know, was a famous photographer. He, in many ways, established photography as an art form. And he was he advocated for it. Then after, he continued to be a photographer all of his life, but he also began to manage and be another advocate for modern art and modern artists. He represented in his Gallery 291 in Lower Manhattan, which was at the epicenter of modernism in the world at that point. He represented Charles Demuth and John Marin and Marsden Hartley. He was their dealer. He was opinionated and outspoken. He was passionate. He knew everyone in New York. He knew everyone in the media. His word could make or break a young artist's career. So Anita spreads out these charcoals on the floor of 291, and he steps back, and this is true from all the reports that I read. He steps back, and this is a man who had publicly said that he was looking for the first great woman artist. Think about that for a sec. But he then said, finally, a woman on paper. And he believed that he had found her, and it was Georgia O'Keeffe. So.
I have a question related to that, but I want to point out two things that are so wonderful in the book.
Yeah.
As I said, Liza knows how to write about creating visual art, and that scene where she draws the charcoals on her knees is so vivid. I mean, you can really imagine yourself into the artist's mind. The other thing that's wonderful, I want to underline your point about underlining, seeing the underlining in the letter, that with the research can really capture you, and it obviously has captured you.
Yeah.
And it's not the kind of research in this book that stands up and says, look at me, I've done this work. But you're really in the rooms with the people and you hear their voices. And speaking of in the room, all right, we get to finally a woman on paper, and or not. There's a wonderful irony in this book. Who is the real feminist? Would the real feminist in the room please stand up? Because we all think of Georgia O'Keeffe as, the first great woman feminist painter, artist, and there's a different story going on here.
Well, there are a couple of ironies in this book. But just going quickly back to your thing about paint, I had to figure out why Georgia wrote back to this girl. I didn't quite know why when she decided to write back, and I decided it was that underscore. Somehow, that was like, I know what you're going through. I understand. So, yes. Stieglitz falls in love with the charcoals. He then falls in love with O'Keeffe, and she falls in love with him. So again, she's 29, he's 52. She's teaching at a small college in Texas, and she gets ill, and he insists that she come up to New York, where he's going to nurse her back to health. And before you know it, they're living together in a small garret that his niece owned, and he begins to shape her career. He also begins to photograph her. Now, he hadn't been actively photographing for a number of years at this point. He was spending most of his time promoting modern artists. And these photographs, I'm sure you'll recognize, these photographs rejuvenate him as an artist. There were probably, I think there were 300 altogether, and many of them were nude. The ones that were nude were cropped, so you couldn't tell who it was, except it was quite clear who it was, because then there were others that weren't nude, and they were of the same style. He was given an exhibit that was a retrospective of his work, and the centerpiece of that exhibit were these photographs, and the centerpiece of that were the nude photographs. And it was, also, I mean, remember, he knew everybody in New York, so he was a master at publicity, and everyone had to come to this thing, and it was a great sensation. She was there. They knew they were having this affair. Look at these photographs. She's nude. Oh my God. So while this is happening, he also is beginning to shape the image of her, of what she's doing as an artist. And he defines it as the essence of the eternal feminine, which to me was code for this is pretty erotic stuff. And as he is doing this, she keeps her mouth shut, but she doesn't like it at all. She finds it offensive, and she actually doesn't like her work talked about. She doesn't think that that's what you should do with art. You should just look at it. It should just be. 2 years after his exhibit, he mounts her first major solo exhibit, including the charcoals, including her early paintings and her oils and watercolors. Same time, he's doing the same promotion thing. He's having her photographs everywhere, Vanity Fair, big profiles of her. This too becomes a massive sellout. I mean, they have to keep it going for a month so people can see it. It's quite the thing. He's making her famous. He's putting her on the map as an artist, which is what she always wanted. At the same time, she's beholden to him. She's running his domestic life too. They're living in these garrets in New York during the winter, and in the summer, the whole family, the extended Stieglitz family, and this is a big family, goes up to the Stieglitz estate on Lake George, and Georgia, as the partner of the oldest son, is expected to run the household. And this usually starts from sometime in early May, right to the end of October. So she doesn't get to paint during that time. And he thinks this is fine. He is doing what she wanted, which is to put her on the map. But she's totally under his thumb, and she'll stay that way for decades. So as he's building her up as this great icon, she's anything but. So that's one of the ironies, for sure.
That's one of the honors that the great feminist turns herself into a housekeeper for the summer.
Right, and unfortunately she knows she's doing it, so,
yeah.
But for a reason.
But then there's Anita, who is not regarded as, I mean, she's not well known.
She's not well known, but she is pivotal in the suffragist movement and in establishing the beginning of the Equal Rights Amendment. She, while this is happening to Georgia, Georgia's life is moving to New York and Stieglitz, Anita realized she's not going to be the great artist. She has someone to compare herself to, so she knows that she's not going to be able to do that. At the encouragement of her sisters, she moves to Washington and she joins the Silent Sentinels, which is the brainchild of Alice Paul, who founded the National Woman's Party. And Alice Paul learned everything she knew from the Pankhursts in England, and she applied their theories to how to approach what you want. And the Silent Sentinels protested silently, peacefully, in front of the White House. You can kind of see it vaguely in the background, for 2 years, from 1917 to 1919. It was during the First World War, and there was a lot of feeling that they were anti-American, and they were treated very badly. They were arrested, they were put in jail. When they started hunger strikes, they were force-fed, they were arrested again. I mean, it was just this endless cycle of imprisonment and protest. At one point, it was still in 1917, late 1917, a number of them were rounded up, and by train they were sent to this truly awful prison called the Octagon Workhouse in Virginia. And it was run by a sadistic superintendent who encouraged his guards to attack these women one night. And they attacked these women with chains, and they beat them. And most of these are upper middle class ladies, and they were brutalized. Reading firsthand account of this, I was absolutely stunned by what had happened. Alice Paul was a master strategist, knew immediately what she could do, and she took this terrible event and she turned it into what she called the Night of Terror, and she got word out across the country that this had happened, and the tide began to turn. People were thinking, well, these women they're just asking for the right to vote. Why were they treated in this way? And momentum began to build for the 19th Amendment at that point. Anita, very young, was sent out to stump for the 19th Amendment across the country. Turned out she was really good at it. She became almost immediately one of the top organizers for the National Women's Party. And when in August of 1920, the 19th Amendment had been approved by Congress, it needed to be ratified. It needed to be ratified by 36 states. It had been ratified by 35 states. And the ratification period was beginning to run out. The Tennessee legislature was being brought back into session specifically to vote on whether or not to pass this thing. And Anita was sent down there. National Women's Party was there, suffragists of all stripes, anti-suffragists, politicians from all over the state, newspaper people from all over the country. This became the place to be that August, very sweltering August too. It was clear from the beginning that the legislature was deeply divided, and it looked like it was evenly divided. The first roll call, it was tied. And the old guard believed they had it in their pocket, and they were furious. And they took another roll call. Again, it was tied. And sort of pandemonium was building in the State House. The third roll call began, and a telegram boy walks across the State House floor and gives a telegram to a young man named Harry Burns. And Harry Burns was the youngest representative in Tennessee history. And he had been voting against this bill. And he looks at the telegram. When it's his turn to cast his vote, he casts a vote for the 19th Amendment. And it passes. Now, the telegram had been written by his mother. And the mother had been visited by one Anita Pollitzer. And the telegram said, "Allow me the right to vote before I die." Now, there's a mother for you. So after the 19th Amendment was passed, now there's Anita in the middle. There's Alice Paul on the far right. After the amendment was passed, Alice Paul quickly realized that that was just the beginning. Getting the vote was just the beginning. In order for women really to have equality, they needed equal rights across the board. And she and Anita, a lot of the silent sentinels disbanded. It was, a much smaller organization at that point, they began to put together the Equal Rights Amendment, and they worked together for decades on this, to try to make the Equal Rights Amendment law. So, yeah, that's where we are with feminism.
The feminism, and I want to. I'm saying things that I remember from the book that you're not saying.
Yeah.
There's a beautiful moment as far as feminism and is it personal? You've got Anita up. No, I'm not Anita. You've got Georgia up there being a housekeeper and a maid and taking care of everybody all summer. And then you have the scene where Anita gets married. I love this. She goes up, they check into a hotel, and she goes up to the room. Her husband says he'll register. And she suddenly realizes when she's in the room, he's going to register as Mr. and Mrs. And he comes up, and she says something to him. He said, "Do you really think I know you that little?" And when I first read this, I remember I emailed you, and I said, this is what year? They were 1920s sometime.
That was a little later than that, I think.
Okay, but even the 30s.
Yeah.
You couldn't register in a hotel under two different names. I mean, they wouldn't let you. This is what a good job Liza has done with this. In my head, I hear the husband explaining to the desk clerk, "Look, this is my wife. She's a feminist. She just got the vote," and all of this. It's absolutely wonderful. And now we get to the sad part.
Yeah.
Which is,
This
is an amazing story.
And this is a spoiler alert because this is a turn. If you don't want to hear it, you better leave now. So George's career continues to thrive. The beautiful oversized flower paintings that are so associated with her. From there, she moves on to other things. Stieglitz and she finally get an apartment in New York City, and she paints a series of absolutely gorgeous cityscapes. Here's one of them. But her marriage is falling apart. Stieglitz had fallen in love with a woman who was half his age. We have someone in the audience who knew her, and I'm just so delighted to have that connection with you. Thank you for coming. Her name was Dorothy Norman, and he had flirtations throughout the marriage. He was that kind of a guy. But this was different, and O'Keeffe knew it, and it devastated her. Her life, both in New York City and in Lake George, began to pall on her. She was having very hard time painting. She was approached by Radio City Music Hall to do a mural for the opening of the hall. So this would be 1928. And she took it. She thought she would make a stand and let Stieglitz realize that she could do things on her own. She negotiated this whole thing on her own. He had always done that before, but she was so angry with what was happening. He hated murals. He hated, he had this thing about murals. And he was dead set against her doing this. And this made her want to do it more. And she worked on this one very hot summer. And as they're putting up the canvas needed to paint the mural, it was on a ceiling and also walls, it collapses on her. Pieces of it collapse around her. And she collapses with it because she kind of realizes it's the end. It's the end of the marriage. It's the end of this part of her life. She has a very serious depression. It takes her actually a couple of years to come back from that. But it's during this period that she discovers and goes out and begins to work in New Mexico and finds this whole new landscape. And also, I think, solace for what was happening to her with Stieglitz in New York. But she began to spend 6 months of her life in New Mexico, painting and working there, and 6 months of her life back in New York with Stieglitz, although he remained for the rest of his life under Dorothy Norman's thrall. He dies in 1946. I just love this photograph of them together. I think this is taken shortly before he died. It took Georgia 3 years to settle his estate in the city. She had to live in New York to do it. She began to really despise New York. She began to cut herself off from all her old friends, especially anyone who seemed to be a friend of Dorothy Norman's. And the one of the few people she remained close to was Anita. Anita, at this point, had finally, after decades and decades, able to get the Equal Rights Amendment in front of both houses of Congress. And she, at that point, Alice Paul had stepped aside, and she became the chairman of the National Women's Party. She was a master lobbyist. She knew everybody in Washington. It was during this period that it was coming before Congress that a faction within the National Women's Party tried to oust her from leadership, claiming that she was spending too much time on international women's rights. Now, Alice Paul, who's still involved with the organization, said to Anita, "That's not what this is about at all. It's not about international women's rights. It's the fact that you're Jewish, and this is an anti-Semitic clique, and you're not going to resign, and they're not going to win. I can't let you step down." And they sue them. And in fact, they win, and she keeps her position. But the Equal Rights Amendment falls apart once again in Congress. And I really think it's because of what happened within the organization. A lot of people thought because of the dissension in the sponsoring organization was a problem. But it was the closest, I think, it ever came to passing. And well, we know where it is now. So, how are we doing on time?
Then the biography. That's the biography of Anita.
Yeah.
Anita's biography,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So Anita retires. She's asked by the Saturday Review to write a profile of Georgia, who is closing Stieglitz's last gallery in New York, moving permanently to New Mexico. And they ask her to write this profile, and Anita says, "Yes, I'd like to." And here is a little snippet of it. It's about Georgia's daily life in New Mexico. "O'Keeffe is unbelievably strong. She not only paints prodigiously, but drives herself to the faraway places she paints, camps overnight to catch the sunrise and sunset, and to see the waterfall after a torrent. Fame still does not seem to be as meaningful or real to her as the mesas of New Mexico or the petals of a white rose." Now, you kind of get the idea. This is not Shakespeare. But Georgia loved it. In fact, she loved it so much that she asked Anita to write her biography. Many people had been approaching her at that point to write her biography. She did not want it. And when Anita said, "I'm really not a professional biographer," she said, "That's not what I'm looking for here. I'm looking for something just like this, something that's affectionate and not pretentious, unpretentious, by somebody who knows me, someone I can trust." So Anita is flattered, and she takes this on. She enlists her husband, the wonderful man who signed her own name to the hotel register, Ellie Edson, who had been a theatrical press agent, who supported Anita, obviously, in all of her efforts. And they start to travel across the country. They interview everyone who knew Georgia, friends and family. They do a ton of research. Georgia, in the meantime, is writing letters of introduction to them to talk to collectors and museum curators. They're sending her drafts. She's looking at the drafts, sending back ideas. They worked on this for 18 years. And over the course of this time, as she's reading the draft, she says, I'm not concerned with how long this is taking. Take your time. But they finally finish it, and they send her their final manuscript in October of 1967. And they don't hear back from her for 4 months. And when Anita does hear back, this is what the letter says. You have written your dream picture of me. That is what it is. I really believe that to call this my biography, when it has so little to do with me, is impossible. And I cannot have my name exploited to further it. I cannot approve it directly or indirectly in any way. If you insist on publishing anything like what I have seen, I would feel I had to withdraw all the letters from it. And in my mind, there's so many shocking things about that response, not least that Georgia had asked Anita to write the biography. She knew perfectly well what was in it because she had read drafts over the years. But to accuse Anita of exploiting her name when she had devoted all this time to the book was just absolutely brutal. But I think it was the letters. It was the letters between them that they wrote to each other across 50 years that in the beginning were so revealing of who Georgia was, of how needy she was, of how uncertain she was. And it was those letters actually that Benita Eisler, in her introduction to these published letters, says, the letters Anita used in the manuscript demonstrate Anita was neither inventing a person or gilding the icon, but the unaffected simplicity of what Anita had to say did not complement or contribute to Georgia's established persona, the legend so ably and elegantly created by Stieglitz. Furthermore, in her own book, and by this she means the oversized coffee table book that I came on, that revealed to me so much about who Georgia was. In her own book, Georgia made use of images and stories from Anita's manuscript. So that's another irony of ironies, right?
Yes.
Still, it doesn't explain to me why Georgia let Anita work on this for so long. And I really like to think it's because a part of her wanted this book published. A part of her wanted people to know who she had been, what their friendship had been. But over the course of the years that Anita was working on it, she was wrapping herself more and more in the cloak of mystery and eternal feminine mystique that Stieglitz had created for her. And when it got to the final moment when she had to decide on this manuscript, because here was a finished work, she had to, a finished work that would threaten the life she was living in many ways. She had to sacrifice, I think, probably her last true friend for her artwork, which is what mattered to her most. So.
It really is a tragic end. I mean, it is a spoiler, but now that you've all heard it, when I got to that after 18 years, I just gasped the idea that she would change her mind after all that.
Well, I was astounded too, just from the beginning when I realized what had happened to them. Yeah.
So I guess we should open it up for questions.
Yep.
Did the two of them have any further communication after that you know of? Or?
That was the last time they communicated. That was the end of the friendship.
Understandably.
She also threatened to sue Anita if she did try to publish a book. Yes. Yes.
What happened to the book? What happened to that book?
I'll tell you what happened to that book. It was never published in the form that Anita had hoped, but after she died, it was published in a book that her nephew had helped put together. She still owned it, even if Georgia plagiarized it. She still owned it, and it's a part of a lovely book that includes photographs and the letters. And it's called Lovingly Georgia, and I use that a lot. I spend a lot of time looking at that. there was nothing about this book that would have hurt anybody. It was just this charming memory of their friendship together. So, no, it was published in a way. Out of print. Yep.
Your son might be incredible story in business, looking lazy, and then English. Let me ask you something. How would you try or explain how do you make a non-fiction historical novel? Because I write neither fiction nor novels, or historical, but I write like history, so I don't understand literature yet. But so, you know.
I think it's a wonderful question. I'm asked a lot because I decided to make this creative nonfiction rather than fiction. As there are a lot of blurry lines, I have to say, between what things are. I would say in the case of creative nonfiction, the facts have to be there. You cannot fool around. You cannot, there's not one character in this that I made up. There are scenes, the conversations that I created, but they're all based on everything I knew that had happened at that time. And in fact, in a lot of the conversations, I tried to weave in snippets of letters or something that I knew had actually been used between them. But that to me is the main thing.
Sure.
I just need a little more clarification, even though you said this, I feel I'm going over it in my mind and saying, what did you miss? What was it about the book that Anita wrote that was so threatening to Georgia?
I think it was the letters. You know, I think, well, first of all, the tone was very light and it was everything that Georgia had asked for. It was very loving and a little bit flowery, but it also used their letters. And even though Georgia could deny that she was like that, that they had this kind of friendship that was so such an important. One thing that Georgia did not want known, interestingly enough, was how influential Stieglitz was in her career. And of course, Anita's writing it, so Stieglitz has a big role in this. But I think the letters were the things. If you read that, I had it excerpted, but if you read that final letter that she wrote to Anita, she was obsessed about the letters not being in there. You can't use those letters. And in fact, she was that same way about her letters to Stieglitz, which are absolutely amazing and monumental. They haven't even published them all, but the book that's published now is, you know, not just a doorstop. It's huge. She was very, very private, and she didn't want any of it known. So that was the main thing.
It sounded like you were suggesting that she was also kind of buying into the myth that he had left her.
Well, I think that's very interesting because I think that she does evolve into that. Originally, when this first began to happen, when he first began to promote her in this way, she hated it. He would mount her exhibits and she would just go to bed. She just didn't want anything to do with it. But she began to realize, especially after he died, how protected this gave her protection. She was able to put a distance between herself and the world, which is what I think she needed to work. And I think that it was an evolution.
So in reading her biographies, I had the experience, and I wonder if you share this, that I really didn't like her. And this is not an isolated incident, there are many incidents in which it is extremely cruel, especially her family and her life.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile this person with extreme cruelty towards people that had this given their life to her, and these incredible paintings that she did that were so.
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile. And I too had a hard time with it. At the same time, I came away with a real sympathy for her. And she had begun alone in her life. This is how I figured it. She started alone. She started like, I'm gonna do this, just leave me alone, I'm gonna do this. And then Stieglitz came. And I will say this, I think she loved him very deeply. And I think he opened her up to the world, and she, changed for him in many ways. And then after he died, she went back to form. Double so, because that's when she really became cruel. But I think that there's sacrifices you do have to make for art. And I think in her mind, this is how she had to do it. She had no choice. I believe she wanted to. I mean, at least in this case, I really do believe that's the only explanation in my mind for how she let this go on.
How long after Stieglitz died was this book presented to her? I mean, years or months?
Well, he died in 46, and this was finished in 67, 68. So, she had 20 years. Yeah. And it was that's very important, because it was during those 20 years that a lot of this solidified within her. Yes.
I don't think yes. It's because the woman's paintings are becoming kind of iconography. Doesn't necessarily mean women trying to leave it. She thinks of herself as a feminist.
Exactly. And in fact, later in life, when the first wave of feminists came to her, literally out in Abaku, to enlist her in something, she showed them the door. She wanted nothing to do with it.
Was she still being the one who's out of the bird? Something
Yeah, no, she was not well known. She was one of these people that, like so many, work behind the scenes to make things happen. And she was happy to do that. She did not live much longer after this. She died in bad with dates, I wrote it down. She lived from 1894 to 1975. Her beloved husband, Ellie, when he died, I think, it was very hard for her. I wanted to end on this, sort of to your question. This is why she was cool, so that she could do this. And I think she felt she needed that protection.
So,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you.